All right, everybody, welcome to another week of our show, the Safely Extreme Podcast. This is for the week of April 25th, 2021. Each week we discuss game design and industry topics. I am, of course, Josh Blazer from Game Wisdom, and joining me, my co-host from Nexus Games, Sharky.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here as usual.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully for anyone watching it on your side, they got a little behind-the-scenes preview.
Yeah, at least until the recorded version goes up and that gets edited out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reason to be live.
Of course. So, for this week, this is a continuation kind of our topic from last week, when we discussed Days Gone By and whether or not it deserved a sequel, or whether you should pay full price for a game, which kind of led to the discussion about getting sequels to titles. So, for this week, we're going to be discussing that a little bit more, and what factors and considerations should go into you designing a sequel for your game.
Yeah, it should be an interesting topic indeed, because there's a lot in deciding if your game should get a sequel.
Mm-hmm. It's not something we really see from independent developers, at least not a lot of the smaller ones. But for most developers, they typically put everything they have into their initial game, and then it's like, where do you go from there?
Yeah. I mean, if we look at Clay, what they've done with Oxygen Not Included was they went into early access, they put everything they wanted on the base level to it. And then instead of doing a sequel, they've done a DLC. A massive DLC. They're still working on. It's a early access DLC, which is the first of its kind as far as I'm aware of.
But with something like with Clay, they typically will work on expansions and post-release support. We haven't seen, a Don't Starve 2 or an Auction Not Included 2.
We got a Don't Starve Together,
Mm-hmm.
which was sort of Don't Starve 2, but not technically.
Which, of course, makes things very tricky when you're trying to discuss this.
Mm-hmm.
So, the one reason I think everyone can think of when it comes to deciding your game needs a sequel is, well, money. It's why lots of AAA developers like to crank out sequels to their games. When my thumbnail, of course, I included something from Assassin's Creed. I think this was Assassin's Creed 2. And the Assassin's Creed series is a really good example of developer wanting to make sequels to their games.
Mm-hmm. And they've made all the sequels. And I think the number one reason to make a sequel would be if it's a very heavy story-based game.
Mm-hmm.
Assassin's Creed used to be that. No longer, but, which is part of the reason why I no longer follow the franchise, because I was deeply, deeply into that story. And then they just said, yeah, we'll can the story and just go on. And it's like, yeah, no interest in it. None at all. And, I think the best place we see this is in traditional RPGs. And by traditional RPGs, I'm referring to what a lot of people refer to as JRPGs. But it's the, genre that had the RPG tag from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And story-driven is definitely a good example for justifying a sequel. The Mass Effect series, pretty much like BioWare titles that are very story-heavy, can get away with not really experimenting too much on gameplay, but continuing the story beats and their trends.
Yeah, well, Assassin's Creed did that at the same time of expanding the mechanics and everything. Because we've seen a lot of story in the first one, and then the second one they expanded the mechanics. They, made everything more playable. They kept on expanding the story, and then they kept on doing that all the way up until the Black Flag, and then that's after Black Flag. That's when they were like, basically to heck with the story, and it's been a downhill journey ever since, in my opinion.
And that, I think, is a very interesting point about how far can you reasonably take a game sequel? And this is a problem that every major franchise has struggled with, is that there comes a point where you really just run out of ideas. You can only, add so much to a game from a mechanics standpoint before it turns into something that is completely different.
Hmm. But if that completely different is slowly over time, then it's can be acceptable kind of thing.
Like Mario,
Because
for instance.
maybe not Mario. Mario is probably not the best example, but a game that evolves a little bit at time over time,
Mhm.
and each of these improvements are enjoyed, and the ones that aren't are scrapped, kind of thing. And then you keep on doing that, and 10 parts down the road, it's a very, very different game. That's fine as long as people that like the game continue to like the game. But
Yeah.
that's a very hard thing to figure out, kind of thing.
hmm And I can't really think of any franchises. Like, maybe we could argue Final Fantasy could be an example of this. That
Well,
over.
Final Fantasy is this weird example because
Yeah.
they're all technically sequels, kind of thing, but they aren't at the same time because they all have unique storylines.
Is that
They
safely extreme, by the way? They're
Yes,
sequels,
yes,
but
it
they're
is.
not?
Yeah, they're basically just different games with the same sort of general theming kind of
hmm
thing, but they have like completely different combat systems, completely different mechanics. I mean, they're all turn-based RPGs until at least
12.
until Square Enix died, or until Squaresoft died rather,
hmm
and Square Enix was born out of the satanic ashes of that game, of the original studio. You know, the original studio is amazing. I could care less about Square Enix, but like when we're talking about Square Enix games, aka 1 through 10, they're all turn based. They're all fantasy based. They're they all still have like a lot of similar mechanics, but they go about them in completely different ways.
hmm
Different ways to use magic, different methods of magic. Like if you look at just a few examples, like Final Fantasy VII was all about you get materia, which are these
hmm
magic gems basically, and you slot them into your weapons, into your armor, and like some of your armors have links in it, and when you link it, the two abilities kind of combine. So like if you were to, take an attack all thing that just attacks all people when you do a regular attack, and then you to combine that with a fire, then you get when you use a fire, it attacks everybody with fire instead of
hmm
just one person. Or like if you did like elemental and fire, then your sword becomes now a fire sword kind of thing.
hmm
And
Or something like the job system that was in, I think, 5.
yeah, and then like 8 had a system where you didn't have magic by default, and you had to go to these points and siphon off magic from certain points, and then you had limited uses of certain spells, and you had
hmm
to go to those points to refill on it,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
And
And then there was like 10 where um magic was on the spear grid, and you had to get over to that area to be able to get there. Of course, characters like Lulu and Yuna were
mhm,
started right over there. And
yeah.
then you had like stuff like
But
Final Fantasy 9 where stuff was limited to like certain characters. Your two summoners.
yeah. But to bring this back on topic, like you can see this gradual evolution in major long-standing franchise, and you need to have that for these franchises to stay relevant, especially if you're trying to attract more people to it. Because story driven games don't necessarily attract new people, because how are you supposed to keep up with these stories? Final Fantasy, of course, has had the advantage, as Shark said, that each game is essentially its own self contained story featuring similar themes. But
Mm-hmm.
you don't need to play 6 to play 7. You don't need to play 8 or 9 to, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from a mechanics standpoint, like that, the gradual evolution iteration is something that it works, I think, until it doesn't. And we've seen franchises that try to push their own boundaries, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Call of Duty, for instance, had the one that was in the far future that I don't really hear too many people talk about, and then they immediately follow that up with what was it, World at War II.
Well, that's because for Call of Duty, they have two different studios working on it at the same time. So at any time, there's two Call of Duties in work. So like one studio made the World War II at the same time, the other one was making the futuristic one, and the futuristic one got done first because they're offset. They're 2-year development cycles with and when the one released the future one, the World War II one was a year into their cycle.
Yeah. And then, like, an example of a developer that would kind of went, like, above and beyond, as we said earlier, would be something like Assassin's Creed. That the second Assassin's Creed was miles above the first one. We could also argue stuff like Hitman as another example. And this, I think, is a very important point we need to discuss when it comes to game sequels. Is there's a reason why the first game in any, like, major franchise is often not the one that's most remembered. And the reason is that for many developers, your first game is your testbed. This is your chance to see whether or not this idea has merit to be developed into a sequel or a franchise. And I think this is different from independent developers, who, as we've said, most indies, they treat their game as be-all, end-all. This is my idea, I am going to put everything into it, and, that's it. I'm not thinking about what's coming 5 to 10 years down the line.
Yeah, which is both a good thing and a bad thing.
Yep.
Because it's good because you get the game out that you want to get out, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's bad because the fact is sequels is a good way for developers to make more money, kind of thing. Because the thing is, with a sequel, is it's less work and you get arguably the same or more amount of money from it, kind of thing. And because you already have all the assets from the first game that you can use in the second game, and all the code and everything else, and music, and then you just have to add to that, and you could add to that and make the experience so much better, kind of thing. But the question is if you were able to put everything in that first version, what are you going to add to it, kind of thing? Now then, here's where that comes in. Is as an indie, you need to make sure that the game is good enough to actually keep people engaged and playing it, kind of thing, for long enough that they're happy with the purchase and they don't refund it. So you need to put a lot in there. Or maybe not a lot, but you need to put enough, which is a lot, if that makes any sense.
Enough, but not so much again.
Yeah. And really, I think what you want to do is, after you release that, if you see any problems, any issues, anything that you want to do to it that isn't bug fixes or, this needs to be in there because this isn't holding people. If there's something you see that is not that, and there is enough of that kind of thing, then maybe that would be worthwhile for a sequel. But at the same time, if you don't put enough updates after a game comes out, people are going to say your game is dead. So like you need to, there needs to be a good bit of stuff, not only stuff that you can update, but a long list of stuff that you can do for a sequel, kind of thing.
Yeah, and this is again where a lot of developers tend to struggle. And what we've seen is this idea of almost compartmentalizing their design. Chris Park has spoken about this several times with his games over at Arkin, that he treats his each game as kind of an encapsulation. So, the first game will do X. If it sells well enough, I have ideas for, A, B, C, D, E, F, G in terms of mechanics and systems. And he
Mm-hmm.
treats it more like expansions and blowing up his game like that. But the idea, of course, is that your first game should be complete enough that it stands on its own.
Mm-hmm. Which we've run into many developers where their first game does not stand on its own.
Mm-hmm. And that's
And they put supposedly everything into it.
yeah. And that is a major point. That for a lot of developers who treat their first game, you have to be able to do everything to justify that first game. If your first game is horrible, a sequel may help, but you're kind of starting on rocky footing just from the get-go.
Yeah. And if your first game isn't successful, then, depending on how hard it failed and how hard you were prepared for failure, because you should absolutely be prepared for failure for your first game, but maybe not the first game of a series if it's not your first game, kind of thing. You're not first commercial game. This is your third commercial game, but it's the first game of a series. You should not be planning for failure at that point, but you should be definitely planning for failure on your first commercial game. But the fact is that it's very hard for first time developers to they're making their first time commercial game to get enough in their game. And it's hard to see the writing on the wall, kind of thing. Like, I think I did a fairly good job with my first game, but I look at it in hindsight and it's like I did not do enough. I did maybe nearly enough, but not enough. It's and that's not even talking about the art side. That's just talking about gameplay mechanics and whatnot. And I think I should have gone a little bit farther, but back then I didn't know where to go. Hindsight has given me that vision to know where to go.
And for a lot of developers, they may get stuck into this cycle of, I'm just going to keep developing sequels to my one idea, and, I'm going to build this mega franchise out of it. But the problem is, if people didn't enjoy game number 1, why do you think they're going to enjoy game number 5 or 6? And sequels, for the sake of sequels, often don't end up well.
What you need to do is you need to be sure that first game, if you're planning a sequel, number 1, it's not your first commercial game. Number 2 is that you're making sure there's enough content in that first one. And number 3 is that when you make that sequel, there's enough new in there to keep people engaged and a reason to actually play the next one. And that the first one is successful.
And as we said earlier, there's 2 ways you can go with a sequel, either a story-driven or mechanic-driven. But a lot of the better games typically will do both. That they'll expand on their story while also smoothing out and improving gameplay. Because the one thing you don't want to do is just literally release a carbon copy of your previous game, but maybe instead of a blue background with green trees, it's a green background with blue trees.
Yeah, that's absolutely what you don't want to do. What you want to do is you need to make sure that the sequel is significantly different and better. And the things that you do in that, if your game is not story-based, then obviously story is not a thing with you. But if you're not adding / changing the story, then you're going to have to make up for that in mechanics. Now then, even if you are changing the story and whatnot, you still need to add mechanics. You need mechanics either way, but the question is are you adding a few mechanics and a lot of story? Are you adding a lot of mechanics and no story? Are you adding a hair bit of story and a lot of mechanics? Like in total you need a lot kind of thing. The question is what portion is going into story, what portion is going into mechanics? And also, is your aesthetics getting improved kind of thing? Is your graphical aesthetics? Because depending on how good your aesthetics is in your first game, if you want to improve your aesthetics, if your aesthetics were really on point and just out of this world in the first one, you probably don't want to change that in your second one. Yep. You don't want to mess up a good thing. But if they were really good, you could make them great. If they were so, then this is your first commercial game, or you haven't learned your lessons from your first commercial game, and you need to learn your lessons about art aesthetics, because so and even good art aesthetics does not work. That is the death card for your game.
Yep. And if you're developing a sequel, you have to touch up the art of your game.
Unless your art was already pretty much perfect.
Yeah.
Like Ori.
Or Hollow Knight.
Yeah. I wouldn't say Hollow Knight's art is perfect, but it has a style to it. And they can't change that style. But with Ori, they nailed it. They nailed it, that their aesthetics kind of thing. And with their second game, they didn't change their aesthetics. They made more of it, but they didn't change it.
Yeah.
They just added more. Where if your aesthetics are not like Ori, then they're not the best of what can be made for that game without completely changing up the style. Then you want to maximize the style that you have. You want to, like if your style's not already maximized, maximize it. If your style is maximized, then just make more of it.
Yeah, and to go back to what you said a few minutes ago about, how far to take something with a sequel. This was an issue we saw a lot of AAA developers made back in the old days of the 90s, where every sequel to a popular game just went in a completely different direction. Zelda, of course, became, a side-scrolling RPG. Castlevania had that confusing open-world mess of Simon's Quest. I'm trying to give a few other big examples. And when you go that far with a sequel, you need to be careful not to dilute what made the first game work in the first place.
Yeah, and the sequel should be relatively the same as the original. It shouldn't be a different genre. It should play a lot like the original, because the people who come in to buy the sequel played the original and they want more of it, but they want a better version of that sequel, game. They don't want a different game with the same name slapped on it. They want a better version of the game that they already have. I would say Breath of the Wild is a proper Zelda game, because Breath of the Wild is based off of the original Zelda, the very first one. And it's in a lot of ways, it's a 3D version of that one, but way, way bigger. With more mechanics and physics and all that other stuff, it's really good kind of thing.
Yeah. And to Seed's point about, I think that's FIFA, if I can read that right in my reading your chat. Yeah, like sports games are very weird when it comes to sequels, because they don't again, if you're building your game off of a sport, you can't really iterate on football. Well,
I mean, they can iterate on the design. They iterated with a lot of loot boxes and all that other stuff. But the thing about FIFA and sports games is they're going to a different audience. The people who play FIFA games are in general not gamers, kind of thing. They're not your normal gamers anyway. They're your sports players that when it's off season and they can't watch any games, they're going to play FIFA and make their own game, or whatever, Madden or whatever sport kind of thing, and it's not about, they're not playing video games. They're just experiencing more of the sport that they like kind of thing. And that's where you really get into a really, really different audience kind of thing. And that's the reason why, a lot of the practices that we as gamers hate, like loot boxes and everything, absolutely thrive because they're thriving in those games with people who are not traditional gamers. They're what would you call that? A sporter, somebody who plays sports, or watch sports,
We have to come with a name for that, right?
Yeah. Because, I mean, there's a massive number of those people that just buy a console or buy whatever to play FIFA or whatever sports game, Madden. It is technically a casual gamer, but, I mean, like, they are their own breed kind of thing. They're definitely different than your other casual gamer. So, I mean, casual gamer really might be a overall kind of heading that there's many different types of gamers inside of there. Like maybe we'd call them sport gamers. Sports rules. There you go.
Yeah, and for games like, I think another aspect of this that we haven't touched on yet is the idea of live service. Because live service games are in a very weird spot when it comes to developing them as franchises. You typically don't want to see sequels in a live service game, because so much of their content is built off of their existing framework. And if you try to translate that to a part 2, part 3, part 4, you end up segmenting that fan base, and it can lead to more trouble down the line.
So what's happening with Overwatch 2?
Or Destiny.
Yeah, it's really tricky and probably ill-advised to take a live service and make a second part of it.
Another issue with that is, as we said earlier, with justifying a sequel, can you just... I think we've had this discussion before. If you make a sequel to a game that, let's say, has 6 years built up of content to it, does your sequel automatically have to include those 6 years of content that you've already built for the first game?
I would say it needs to include a lot of it. Probably not all of it, because you want to add new stuff and, characters that are dead, characters that are irrelevant, all that stuff needs to go wayside kind of thing. But,
But in terms of stuff like maps, gameplay systems, loot, stuff like that, people typically expect that stuff to be, and to Foreign's point right there, especially microtransactions. If somebody spend, let's say, $300 on, I don't know, guns and weapon skins and, ship skins, any kind of skins you can think of, and you go to a sequel, what happens to all that stuff they spend money on?
Well, that is a real issue right there. And if you're bringing that, into the sequel, and then they have to rebuy it there.
Ooh, yeah, that's always fun.
Ooh, that is so many red flags right there.
And this is a problem that I think I've seen with Destiny, what kind of keeps me from playing it. So every time I want to try that game out, I hear some horrible anti-consumer issue that the developers are just basically, shooting themselves in the kneecap, adding to their game.
Yeah. And I know with my game that I'm currently making, it's a live service, and it's going to be a very different one that's aimed to be consumer friendly, despite, Josh always calling it pay to win. Everybody else in chat. And you know, there is no sequel to it. I mean, there kind of is, but that's a completely different topic, entirely, because that's me doing something very, very different with not just this game, but all of my games. And let's just say, let's say that. How can I do this without spoiling it? All the games that I'm making is actually technically all sequels. You wouldn't think that Neon Continuum is a sequel to Chromasia, but it is.
And you need to kind of consider like future proofing your game if you're trying to make a live service game work like that. And it's why we see some of the better developers kind of approach their games along that line. Like if we look at Warframe, for instance, Warframe has probably received enough content and improvement over the last decade to maybe justify like 2 or 3 sequels worth of stuff for that game. But they've never, they never even thought about trying to break their game up into, Warframe 2 and Warframe 3.
Mm-hmm.
Same for World of Warcraft.
But yeah, in normal speak, there's not going to be a Neon Continuum 3, outside of my weird stuff, or 2, and is going to be continued development onto Neon Continuum, where we're adding more and more content. We're planning, and the daunting task that very much scares me of having a new set of cards every 3 months, because that's what's expected, and that is scary.
Yeah.
And and while we're doing that, we're also going to be having new modes, new gameplay stuff, all kinds of stuff. New mechanics come out every set, with new powers, new stuff. And, future proofing my UI that I have right now to go into all the future sets is, oh my God, that's been hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how do I get all the stuff that I'm ever going to use when I don't know what it is on here right now, and how do I make it all readable?
Mm-hmm. And yep, that is the problem or the challenge of when you're trying to keep supporting these games. And when we talk about traditional sequels, at least they kind of get around this with each game being its own, encapsulation or compartmentalization of that design. Mm-hmm. But as we said earlier, you still need to be thinking about growing things from game to game, element to element. And I think what you said...
I really think doing a sequel to a live service is really a bad idea.
Yeah.
I think that if you really want to do a quote-unquote sequel to a live service, just do a separate live service that is based off of the original one, but very, very different with very, very different things. You know what I mean? And make it its own live service kind of thing. Like, if I wanted to do a sequel to Overwatch or, Neon Continuum, for example, my game, I would do another game that has a lot of the same stuff kind of thing, but I would change what I wanted to change, and I would run a different theme, and of course that affects different characters and all this other stuff, and it would be a very, very different, separate experience kind of thing, and I'd launch it as a separate experience rather than a sequel. I would just make a different live service that is somewhat similar to the first one kind of thing. That's what I would do. But ideally you don't want it to be so similar, because you might cannibalize the first one. Yep. Unless the first one is dying, in which case that might not be a bad idea.
But if one of your live service games is dying, it's kind of an issue of saying, oh, well, we kind of stopped supporting our first game. Trust us on this one. Give us all your money. We won't, cancel this one in 5 years.
Well, I mean, all live service games have a limited time period, a limited life. And that's the sad thing about it. And that really hurts game preservation, and I'm doing everything I can to to preserve it. But in mind. But the thing is nobody should go into live service expecting that live service to be there 5-10 years down the road. Most live service games don't even make it a year. A lot of live service games don't even make it a month. Because if you don't have enough players from day one, your game is dead on day one. Which is a real challenge I'm dealing with right now, trying to get that amount of players before we launch, which is a bare minimum of 3,000 before you launch. And that's difficult. Unknown indie with, a very, very small fan base needs to somehow get 3,000 players for a game that doesn't exist yet. Is that safe play stream?
Sure, or masochism. And when you're trying to decide to make a sequel and wanting to go that route, I think let's talk a little bit more about things from a mechanics standpoint, in terms of where do you improve, where do you change? Because like we said, there's a risk of going too far. And we've seen developers struggle with this. That their first game, let's say, was a modest success. Let's say it was a simple 2D platformer. And then for their sequel, we're going to make a fully 3D open world quasi RPG, 30 to 80 hour long experience.
Sounds legit.
And what ends up happening, or what usually ends up happening, is that not only do you burn the goodwill of the people who like your first game, but you've completely gone over budget for what the first game actually earned, and now you're even deeper in the hole.
Yep, and now your studio is shutting down because you don't have the money to keep it up, and you completely ruined everything you had.
And it's
like making a meal, and then everybody's like, yeah, that's really good, and then you go and take a poop on it, and everybody's like, yeah, we're throwing this food in your face. And now not only do you not have good food or people eating it, but you got food on your face.
And
no money left.
We had an almost example of that with Trine. That the third Trine basically ditched the 2.5D design for full 3D, and everybody hated it. It is the only game in the franchise right now that has mixed reviews, and it almost shut their studio down because they were putting everything into that game.
And you never want to do that. You always want to have a cushion to, if this game fails, what then? And, and sadly, I don't know the answer to that to my current game, mainly because I started off wrong, and I was basically, the first game killed the studio, but then somehow I was able to keep it going by the skin of its teeth to make the current game. And I was already 1.5 feet in the grave from the last one, and I'm struggling to try to recover for this one because I did it wrong, and I was not planning for my first game to be a failure, and you should always plan for your first game to be a failure. And because of that, it's put me in a really, really bad spot for the second one. And if the second one does not go through, there's no plan for me. The only plan I have at the moment is to get focus on something that's not game dev, focus on life, take all my money, spend it in a way that would reduce my bills, like buying a house, solar panels, that kind of stuff, so that I would have more spendable money. And then once I had that, then I could, take that more spendable money, save up more money, and therefore have money to attempt game number 3.
And to Foreign's comment, Super Meat Boy Forever is a example again of really trying to push things in a completely different direction. And you have to be careful about that, especially if you're trying to design a sequel versus a spin-off. Because if you
Mm.
try and make a spin-off, you can do whatever the hell you want in that. If you
Yeah,
want
absolutely.
if you want Mario to, play tennis or golf or throw parties, you can do that. You just, call it Mario Party, Mario Tennis. You don't call it Super Mario World, Mario Tennis.
Well, Allie has a good question. Why not work and make a game in the free time? Well, the thing is my work. I technically do that right now already. And see, my work is disability, so I can't, clone myself and then get disability a second time. And not to mention that would raise the bills. So, wouldn't really work. Only a reduction in bills to make that little bit of money I got go farther will actually help. That's my special situation. So, that's why that is a thing.
So here's a interesting point that I was thinking about. When you're looking at a sequel to a game from a mechanic standpoint, is there ever such a thing as my mechanics are perfect, why change anything?
hmm And that's a hard one because
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to mess up what you already have. But the question is, can you add more to take advantage of it? And if the answer is no, then a sequel is almost completely out of the question unless you can add completely different story because it's a very, very story based game. That would be the only exception there. If you and that would be a very risky one at that because you're not adding any kind of mechanics. Because you always want to at least add somewhat mechanics, so like
Mm-hmm.
you're playing with fire there. It might be possible, but you know changing those mechanics is also playing with fire
Yeah.
if everything is also perfect the way it is. Now the
Yeah.
question is though, is it really perfect the way it is? And
Mm-hmm.
it probably isn't.
Yep.
the,
And
the, the reason why you probably think that is because you're probably listening to a vocal minority.
or you
Although it
ignore
may be
negative
accurate.
reviews,
Huh?
or you just ignore all negative reviews.
Yeah. Now then, the place where it might actually be correct is if you're the developer of FTL kind of thing, because there's ways to make it fair, but those ways to make it fair will probably ruin what's already there gameplay wise.
Mm-hmm.
So, you probably don't want to do that. Like as far as I can see, there's no way other than art aesthetics to improve onto FTL.
Mm-hmm.
There's ways to build do your own version of FTL that's very, very different kind of thing, but yet a lot of things that are saying that is really good to make. But an actual direct sequel, besides just improving the art aesthetics, I can't think of any way to improve that game, other than making it more fair, which would downgrade the quality of the game, sadly. And that's one of those weird examples to where there's places to improve it, but those places ruin the game.
Mm-hmm. I could see a few areas, especially in terms of adding more content and just going more in the supplemental route for it.
I
But
mean, if you added more content, you're talking about like more weapons and stuff, more items.
more events, more areas you can explore, things along those lines.
Issue is if you add more to each of those, then random generation is going to more sparsely, give out everything else. And it's already hard enough to get a build as is with what's in there. And if you have it more sparse, then it's going to be way, way harder to get a good build, which means that it may be even less playable because of that.
Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge of, especially in roguelike design, in terms of continued support because you're dealing with RNG. And RNG for a roguelike, content for a roguelike is different from content from a single player or a linear driven game. If you want to make a sequel to an 8-hour story with another 8 hours, yeah, you can do that. For a game that's supposed to be 30 minutes to an hour long with playable chunks, it's a lot harder to add stuff to because you don't want to balloon that time. Because the worst you can do to a roguelike is say, okay, your normal run is an hour. We're going to now make it so now it's a 3-hour run.
Yeah, definitely not something you want to do. But the question is are you, also, ruining what's there by
You're
not
breaking.
necessarily filler content, but by putting more content, you're filling out the area, meaning it's less likely to get the stuff that already people want. So if people want these things and they don't want your new thing, or maybe they want one new thing and 3 other things kind of thing, but you added 30 new things kind of thing, then the odds of them getting the one new thing they want is way down than what it was, and the odds of them getting the 3 old things they want is way, way down, because the odds of everything are way, way down. And to be able to get that in that limited time period of a roguelike, it's so much harder, and it becomes almost impossible to get a good build at that point. Mm-hmm. Because having too much content in a roguelike can be a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. And to Amir's question, yeah, Nintendo definitely makes sequels. They have certainly, I think, really gone that route. They really don't make too many completely original games, but when they do, we then tend to stop and think, are they going to make a sequel to that?
Mm-hmm.
And yet,
Splatoon, and then Splatoon 2.
Mm-hmm. Or that Hands game, or whatever it was. The boxing, or Pikmin.
But anything that gets a really good, I think anything that they, do the test bed and it works out well, then they do sequels. Mm-hmm. Although a lot of Nintendo sequels aren't very sequel-y. They're very, a lot of times they're often the same thing with a small,
with improvements.
They're more like half sequels a lot of times. They're underwhelming a lot of times.
But again, Nintendo gets away with that because they're Nintendo.
Yeah.
But when we see traditionally, like, in terms of mechanics and sequels, it's about delivering more, but also different. And what we mean by that is, if your last game is a 2D platformer, we're going to assume your next game will be a 2D platformer, but we expect new things in it. That's what we saw with Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Hollow Knight Silk Song sounds like it's going to be the same kind of design as well. That, yes, it's going to be the same gameplay loop, but we're giving you a different element, or we're giving you a different slice of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and, Ori did a lot of the similar things. They have a story-based game though, so they give you a whole new story kind of thing, and then they give you new and different powers and all this other stuff, as well as some returning powers and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Got my phone ringing in the other room. We'll hopefully get a good voicemail in a second, but yeah, the more powers the more things you can do to expand on your game is certainly how you can develop it as a sequel. Now, Ori is different, or Ori has a unusual exception, is that they did do a lot to fix nagging issues with the first game. As we said, more people finished Ori 2 than they did Ori 1.
Well, that was also because more people bought Ori 2.
Mm-hmm.
Because success begets success.
Yeah. But a lot of it is just the fan base. There's a higher clear rate in Ori 2 than there's in Ori 1. And that is simply by, the percentage of people who are actually looking at that game. And one of the things that they did in Ori 2 was try to streamline that design. And we see that typically in a lot of sequels. Or shall I say in a lot of good sequels. That if something annoyed people in the second game, how do we fix that for the third game?
Mm-hmm. And streamlining is always important.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to be as streamlined as possible in your first game, because if you're not streamlined enough in your first game, then likelihood there won't be a second game because your first game failed.
Yep. And what we see from developers who tend to struggle is that they they don't see the mistakes with their games, and they just keep compounding them with each new title. Especially UI design. I think that's another biggie that a lot of developers struggle with trying to make their UI better. And this is one of those areas that we can touch on a lot of different points about this. Like Grim Dawn, over like what was it, like 3 different expansions, have done I think multiple UI passes with that game.
Yeah. One game we could talk about is Ark. While they don't have a sequel yet, they're about to. But one could say that each one of their DLCs are sort of sequel-ish. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And while I love Ark and it's a really fun game, it has lots and lots of issues. UI issues.
Mm-hmm.
It has playability issues to where there's no tutorials, nothing to onboard you. Even the controls are differ all the time. You get on one dinosaur, and right button does this, does some kind of something, and the right button does some kind of something. But on some dinosaurs, the Z button does something. On some dinosaurs, the X button does something. On some dinosaurs, the C button does something. On some of them, 2 of those do something. On some of them, all 3 of them do something. And it seems like it's all at random kind of thing. And I think there might be a few other buttons kind of thing that are in there. And it's like, why? Why can you not get some consistency in there? And like when they go to their emotes, they have this spinning wheel kind of thing where you it's a circle where they you just go up and you select a thing to pick an emote, but you can only put 3 on shortcuts kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But they keep on adding new ones, and they're not updating the UI. So when it was at first, it was like, there's 5 different choices. Okay, this is what makes a really good spinning wheel. But when there's like, I think like now like something like probably about 50 or 60, maybe even 100 different choices. Every one of those things are just a very small sliver of that thing, and it is very easy to misclick, and it's horrible design now because they haven't updated it, other than just cluttering it up to a design that used to work with a design that doesn't work now.
Yep.
And they have many, many usability issues, and instead of fixing any of those, they're just doing DLCs that add new maps, new dinos, and new story kind of thing. Yeah. And they just keep on going forward rather than fixing what they need to fix in the past.
And what could end up happening is that if they do decide to make a sequel, there's a good chance
they've already announced.
Okay. There's a good chance a lot of people aren't going to buy that sequel, because if I got so annoyed and frustrated with your first game, why should I buy your second game to be annoyed and frustrated with that? And it's an issue that we see from a lot of developers, where they're surprised when less people buy their second or third game. And this is another point about why sequels are very risky, is that the advantage of a sequel is that the first game or the previous game gives you a good idea of the fan base. If the first game, let's say, sold 100,000 copies, you can assume that there's 100,000 people who would buy your second game. But if that second game turns out bad or horrible, let's say only 40,000 people buy that one, do you think people are going to come back for your third game, or your fourth game, or your 8th game?
Yeah. And the Rat Tails question, we've already pretty much talked about it, but that would be classified as a live service, and we basically said that you basically do not want to do a sequel to a live service game. You would want to do a different game. And I know that Magic the Gathering had the non-live service games before Arena kind of thing. And I heard they might be going back to that, and that's not a good sign. They need to stick with Arena kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And you have to be very attentive as to where you want your game to go from a mechanic standpoint. Because as we've said, people expect improvements. I do think there's always room to try and change or do something different. Like with the Hollow Knight example, like as we were talking about, like Silk Song looks like it's going to be a different game because it was originally said to be an expansion that does its own thing. Now that'll be an example of an expansion becoming a sequel. While something like I know with like XCOM War of the Chosen, they also did something similar. They added so much to it that it felt like it could be its own sequel, but they eventually decided to
Its
put
own
that back
spinoff?
into the game. What was that?
You mean its own spinoff?
No, I think they were going to call it XCOM 3 at one point from Firaxis, but again, I would still love to talk about kind of their development process for that game.
But we talked before. We have another talk on whether a game should be a sequel or a spinoff kind of thing, and we're hitting on a few of those points, and I want to hit on one more. Is if you're going to make a game that is too different from the original, you need to make that a spinoff.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to make that a sequel.
And you do.
I mean, all card games alter rules every set because there's new powers that come out every set, and with those new powers are new rules because those the powers are the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have your baseline rules that don't change generally, and then you have the powers that override the rules. Because I mean, by default, you don't draw a card besides at the start of your turn. But when you play a card that says draw a card, then you're adding a rule to draw a card for that one turn. So like the card powers are the rule. They're the extra rules that get added based off of when you play them. But yeah, changing baseline rules, that usually doesn't happen. Yeah. Unless it's a different mode. And if you're going to different modes, you would have different baseline rules.
Yeah. And again, if you're completely changing the core gameplay loop of your title, that's definitely not what you want to do in a sequel. You want to say that for a spin-off or, do something else with that.
Or a different mode in the current game, or DLC or something like that.
But you don't remove your core gameplay loop and say, oh, now you have to all play just like this, because that will piss off people.
Yeah, I swear nobody's ever done that before. Thanks to several bad examples.
Yeah. Now, yeah, and again, if it's built off of it, or you can design it as its own unique segment that you play with, rule set A or rule set B, that would be different.
That would be a different mode.
Now,
there are certainly games that have modes like that, and I think there might be some card games that have different modes like that.
Now, we are approaching about an hour in, and I think we can start to wrap things up. There's one point that I do want to discuss, I think, when it comes to sequels that we haven't really hit on yet. And that is building a game or taking a franchise and kind of bring it to the modern market. And what I mean by that is the idea of, let's say you release game number 2 in 2002, and now you're working on the third game, let's say for 2022's release. How do you approach a sequel when you also have to deal with a changing market? Because as we've said, the market changes constantly. Every few months, it's like there's a different rules or different things to consider. So when you are looking at a sequel, especially to something, I think another point, I guess, to build on top of this is that when we talk about sequels to games, these are usually developed in years. It's not, I think about a sequel, 6 months later the game is out. If you're doing that, it's probably going to be a horrible sequel. So one of the challenges you have to consider is that where people are in the market when you start designing a sequel could be in a completely different spot when that game is released.
Mm-hmm. And what you need to do is definitely streamline, and especially the UI, because UI is where a lot of things change.
Yeah.
UI and aesthetics, is where technology and time usually affects.
I would also
want a game to be more usable to the current market at the same time as you want the art aesthetics to be good enough for the current market. And this is where we see adventure games failing. But adventure games is a very unique genre because it's the adventure game genre, in my opinion, is pretty much dead. It's not technically dead, but it's dead because the thing is
it's dead, but it's not dead. It's undead.
Yeah, it's a zombie. And here's the thing: is genres over time evolve and change, or they drop off, kind of thing. And adventure games did evolve, kind of thing, and they became kind of part of RPG, kind of thing. But there has been the original adventure game. There has been people who have been holding on to that and not letting the original fade. So
or iterating.
They don't iterate. They they did iterate and get to RPGs, kind of thing, and all these other genres, because that came in. They spread out into many different iterations, kind of thing, but spiderwebbed, if you were. But they've been holding now. Adventure games stand as the original kind of thing, and the fan base, the few fans that follow adventure games, kind of thing, they like the adventure games the way it is. And if you try to innovate or iterate in any kind of way, you're pretty much screwed, because they're not going to pick it up. And that little bit of change is going to mean that nobody new is going to pick it up either. So you have to either iterate so much that none of the fan base that's there for it is going to buy it, and only new people will buy it, or you have to be stagnant and just release the same old thing to get the same old people to buy it.
Yeah, but unfortunately,
people eventually die because time is a thing. The genre is going to disappear completely. Yeah. Well, not even those people die; just enough of them die, because the fact is there's no new people getting in there, and people die over time. So, eventually, it's going to become the point of where it's unsustainable, and at which point, either they're all going to die all at the same time, or each studio is going to drop like flies one after another, kind of thing. Like I said, dominoes, until they're all gone. Or it could just be all of a sudden where they just all drop out at the same time.
This got very morbid for the end of this discussion, didn't it?
Yeah, it did.
To Amir's comment, best reason to make a sequel: if you can justify it with new content, whether from a story perspective, a mechanic perspective, ideally both, that you can refine and iterate on your design while continuing to tell the story or telling a new story in that space.
Yeah, and I would definitely suggest going back and watching the replay of this.
And everyone liking and smashing and hitting those buttons, too.
Yeah, lick the smash button, smash the lick button.
So here's an example I want to bring up. For those of you who don't remember, there's a game called King of Dragon Pass, which is considered to be one of the most top-tier, unique kind of strategy, almost like a strategy RPG style games. It's a game that for the people who play it, they consider to be one of the best games and one of the best storytelling games ever conceived. So this game's been out, it's been out since the late or mid-90s. So a few years ago, they decided to do a sequel, 6 Ages. So this was a sequel that was designed, to continue that story. Here's the problem. They did absolutely positively nothing in terms of UI UX. They just basically, you know, uplifted everything or upended everything from the first game, made all new art, made all new story, and then dropped it into the game to be released in 2019. And guess what happened? A lot of people didn't play that game. Right now, it sits at 266 reviews, and it's been out for about 2 years now.
Mm.
And while that game, depending upon how much it cost to develop it could have earned back that money, that is, yeah, but that is definitely not a studio successful game.
No.
And it again brings upon this point that UI and UX are always areas where you can iterate on. Like, it's like one of those things that I see, like when we watch like reality shows, when people are having to build something or construct something, and they finish like an hour early before everyone else, and then they just stop working. That there's always things that you can improve on. And when it comes to game design, especially if you're building sequels, and even more so if you're building sequels to long-running games, I'm talking, 5 to 10 year gap between them, you can't just build everything the same way. There are improvements. And I'm not sure this could be its own talk, but there's definitely an issue with developers just not looking outside to see where things have gone in terms of the market, and even in terms of their same genre.
To rest to a question, what point do they become financially viable? Well, the first game has to be successful, first of all. Mm-hmm. The first game has to be financially viable. And number two, because if the first game is not financially viable, then why would people pick up the second one?
Not only that, but if only 50 people played your first game, that's not a huge fan base to pull from if you want to try and continue that sequel. Because again, if you're making a sequel, people expect more. Mm-hmm. And how much more will you be able to add to convince 50 more people, to convince those same 50 people to buy it? And really, you want more than 50 people to buy your sequel. You want more people to be buying each game in a franchise, not less.
Yeah. And the thing is if you're doing that kind of thing, what you want to do, rather, is because fan bases will transfer to other games. You have to make the game similar enough, kind of thing. And by similar enough, I mean don't go from making a tactical RPG to making a first-person shooter.
Unless you're making a spin-off.
Even if you're making a spin-off, I don't think you should.
Or a new franchise.
I don't think you even should do it as the same developer. If you start a new studio and then do that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And to Amir's question, again, that's kind of what we've been discussing over the last almost an hour and 15 minutes, that you have to be able to understand why people came to your game in the first place. Because, as we said, there's always room for improvement, there's always room for growth. And like we've said, the beauty about this is you can add whatever the hell you want. But that doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to like adding whatever the hell you want to their favorite game. Again, like with Mario. If I play a Mario game, I'm expecting platforming, jumping, and movement tech. If they turn Mario into a slow pace... well, if it's a spin-off, if they turn into a stealth game, if they decide that Super Mario Odyssey 2 is going to be a survival horror, crawling, prone walking for an hour and a half to avoid Bowser, I'm not going to be happy there.
Well, would you be happy if they had named, instead of taking Mario RPG and calling it Mario RPG, would you be happy if they called that Mario 5 or whatever, wherever in the timeline that falls?
Yeah. I think a lot of people would be annoyed there. Now,
a lot of people would be pissed.
Yeah. But they basically said, the Nintendo developers, we're not doing it, we're not touching this. This is Square Enix's baby. And again, that was where that spin-off was born.
Yeah, Luigi's Mansion. You know, if they put Luigi's Mansion as Mario 8 kind of thing, people would have been pissed.
Incidentally, they did call the first Wario game Super Mario Land 3 Wario's World or Wario Land.
Well, they have Wario's Land in there, which is a subtitle. So I mean, it's sort of semi skirts the rules on that.
And then Wario became his own franchise, and they just kept making sequels to that, which then spun off into the WarioWare games.
Mm-hmm. But wasn't that the first Game Boy game too that they made?
No, the first one was Super Mario Land. That was just a traditional Mario platformer.
All right.
And then Wario Land's when they added in kind of like the puzzle elements and, hunting down the treasures.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe someday we'll get a Waluigi game that I know everyone's been dying to play.
Well, seeing how the Luigi is Ghost, the Mario RPG is an RPG, and the / Paper Mario, and the traditional Mario is a platformer. What genre would be Waluigi's?
I don't know. Let's for you guys watching this, recorded or live, leave that in the comments. What do you think Waluigi's game genre should be?
I would say a tactical RPG, but that's already been done with Rabbids Mario. So
and
it can't be a tactical
Sniper
RPG.
Luigi.
maybe it'll be a first-person shooter with Luigi, and he'll, and then it'll be the teabagging, with Waluigi.
But
that would totally fit.
But I do want to touch on one thing about the adventure genre and modernizing or refining sequels. And I think this will be our final point because we are kind of over our time. But one of the issues, as Shark said, regarding the adventure game genre is that there have been plenty of sequels and spiritual successors and spin-offs and more franchises in that space. But none have really, I think, truly refined or iterated. Now, there's probably a few out there. I think, of modern day adventure game design, the stuff from Wadget Eye, I think, probably comes the closest to trying to make a more approachable point-and-click adventure game. But the problem, and it's something that we see all genres struggle with, is that what worked 15 years ago doesn't work today. And if you try and do that, sorry, my nose is stuffing up. If you try and just make the same game that worked 10 years ago, you are just basically burning your whole company down.
Mm-hmm. According to Rats, the Waluigi game is going to be the next Rosetta tier.
Nice. Capitalism ho.
Rosetta Waluigi. Or Rosetta. Waluigi Rosetta.
But again, there's that problem when it comes to trying to bring these games back. We saw this even with Evil Genius, that a lot of people did not like Evil Genius 2. They felt that the changes that they added made the game worse, and the problems in the first game are still in the second game. And if you have a sequel, again, another major point about sequels, if there are problems, if there are noticeable issues that people brought up with game number 1, you better damn well fix them for game number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, people are going to be even more pissed off, because while the first game is considered your test bed, it's also where people will give you the benefit of the doubt. Yes, it's an issue with this game, but it was their first game doing it. If you're still making that same mistake 8 games in, people are going to basically hate it all the more magnified, because it doesn't seem like you're doing anything to make this sequel better.
Because you're technically not.
Exactly.
You're adding more, you're changing stuff, but you're not making it better.
Mm-hmm. And going back to Foreign made a comment about Path of Exile 2. I am very interested to see how they're going to refine and iterate on their sequel, because they are taking, I think it was supposed to be an expansion, now they're just making a full-blown sequel. And as we all know, like historically speaking, Path of Exile was basically, the shots fired against Diablo 3 because Diablo 3, Blizzard did such a horrible job of making a sequel to Diablo 2 in the first place.
Mm-hmm. We'll see, if Path of Exile does the same to Path of Exile.
Mm-hmm.
If they do a horrible sequel.
I have not played a RuneScape, unfortunately, Raziel, so I can't comment on that. But let me get to Amir's comment, because he said his first, then we'll get to Rats, and then we'll wrap things up, I think. But to Amir's comment about making games as platforms, this is what we've been discussing in terms of live service. That it's not just I release a game and then it's done. It's I release a game and then we'll keep supporting it and keep building on it. And that is certainly a valid strategy. It's definitely high risk, but it can lead to rewards and lead to these games having a far longer shelf life. I don't know if...
The thing about a live service game is it's sort of an inverse early access game. Where early access is we're building up to completion kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
What live service is, here's completion. Now we're going to make it
even better and bigger.
Better.
Yeah.
Until you get to this massive size, and you're trying to keep it going, forever. And that requires a lot of work, a lot of scheduling, because people require regular updates. And depending on the size of those updates and whatnot, to how frequent.
Yeah. And one thing we haven't discussed that's like the complete counter example to what we've been talking about is Supergiant Games. They've made, what are we up to? 5 games, I think, over the last decade, each one completely different. The same for Clay Entertainment. And for them, they treat their studio as kind of, a platform for different unique titles, as opposed to just making one game or making one franchise. And that is a very viable option, especially if you have a team that can work along those lines.
But maybe we should talk about the advantages to do a sequel. Because there is a specific advantage to this.
Mm-hmm.
And if this advantage does not apply to you, then you probably don't want to do a sequel at all. But, everything else is also required to do a sequel, that we've already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But the advantage is you've already got art established, you've already got code established, you've already got a lot of these assets established.
And you have a fan base. Don't forget that.
And you got a fan base established. So off of these things, it's easier to build up a game because you already have the leg up of what's already done. So now you can spend more time, maybe making the art better, maybe making the UI better, maybe making the code less buggy, maybe making the code more efficient, maybe making, adding new gameplay mechanics, adding new art, new mechanics, a lot of stuff, and you can build upon it and just make it a vastly better game. But, that requires a game that is able to be made vastly better while being good enough to be a commercial success in the first place, because if it's not a commercial success in the first place,
why wouldn't we buy a sequel?
Yeah, if the first one is not a commercial success, then making a sequel is a bad idea.
Yeah. Now, if to build up what Shark just said, a lot of, as we've said, when it comes to first games, that they are the test beds. You don't want to do 15 things, adequately in your first game. You want to do a few things really well, and then say, okay, now that we know that this works, what can we add to build on top of that? This is what happened with Assassin's Creed to Assassin's Creed 2. The first game was not the best game. It had a lot of issues with it. But it did well enough for them to say, okay, let's try it again. And what they did was say, okay, we're going to take everything that didn't work, and we're going to fix that or remove it. And the sequel is, again, just miles above. Like, imagine somebody, like, if somebody only played the first Assassin's Creed game, they probably think it's a horrible game. They have no idea why it got so popular. And I played that first game and I didn't like it. But I finished the second game and I love that title.
I enjoyed the first one, but the Ezio trilogy, aka parts 2 through 4, that's just technically labeled as 2, those were by far the height of the series kind of thing.
And again,
they were not the best gameplay wise, but they were the best overall kind of thing. The third game with Connor, that was a pretty bad train wreck. But the fourth game, the Black Flag, that one was really good. They really nailed the gameplay and everything in that. The story took more of a backseat though, and that was the last game they made where the story meant anything, and the story meant very little in that one. Yeah. But it did mean something. But that was the only one I 100%ed kind of thing of the things, despite it not being my favorite. My favorite being the Ezio trilogy, aka the 3 games classified as part 2. But while they are my favorite, they're not the best gameplay wise, because Black Flag was better in gameplay wise, because, like, for example, in the Ezio trilogy, you had those freaking annoying notes that you had to chase around everywhere to try to get 100%. And those things were so annoying and bad. But in Black Flag, those are not in there.
Yep, and again,
you got cool stuff that you do, and really fun. And something I want to talk about is what not to do with a sequel.
All right, and this will be our last point as we are approaching an hour and a half.
My point is going to be made around the Kingdom series, because I really like that game, but I do not like what they did with the sequel. They had the Kingdom Classic, and then they went to Kingdom New Lands, and then Kingdom Two Crowns. And Kingdom Classic was really good, but there wasn't enough there. It wasn't enough to solidify a full game, because it was one map with one objective. Once you beat it, you were done. And it wasn't all that long kind of thing. It wasn't all that hard. It wasn't there just wasn't enough there. There wasn't enough content there to make a game. And then Kingdom New Lands was just Kingdom, but with more maps, and I think one minor mechanic. And it was like, okay, why was this not an update into Kingdom Classic? And because this is nothing kind of thing. This is nothing new, really. And then they came out with Kingdom Two Crowns, which, with Kingdom New Lands, but with like 2 new mechanics. And like, they got rid of the 5 or 6 old boards from New Lands and added new 5 or 6 maps. And it's like, yeah, but this isn't really doing anything different. And it just feels like Kingdom was just an early access game that I had to buy 3 times to get the full version of the game, rather than legitimately being different enough and adding enough to be sequels kind of thing.
And again, like we've said, if there are legitimate issues in your first game, you don't wait until the 6th game to fix them. You need to get them fixed in the second game. And as Shark said, like, if there's not enough, if there's still bad stuff in your sequel, is that really justifying another game if you're not able to actually improve on each game in your franchise?
Or just not enough.
And here's my final point. Again, one of the reasons why sequels are so important to the game industry is that this is how we see design evolve and grow. That there has to be a start. There has to be a foundation for people to build on in order to then experiment and do something outside the box. As we've said, the reason why we see so many sequels is that a lot of the guesswork and uncertainty of your design has already been answered. What's my core gameplay loop? Well, whatever was in the first game. What's going to be the art and aesthetics? We already got that. What are our mechanics and systems? From there, you're able to then take that further. It's like that old, like the South Park meme, step one, build a game. Step two, question mark. Step three, profit here.
Yeah.
But
I want to make one more point about Kingdom. The when you buy the third game, the Kingdom Two Crowns, there's absolutely no point of buying the first two. And that's what you don't want. You don't want your new game to mean there's no reason to buy the original.
Makes your previous ones obsolete.
Yeah.
And we've seen developers do that. There are a lot of examples of that, especially from indie developers who there's 7 games in this franchise, don't even bother with the first 6.
Mm-hmm. Because the 7th one has everything the first 6 do and more.
And it's better and it's more refined.
But you know what? Don't bother with the 7th one because the 8th one is coming out in a year from now, and it's going to have everything that 7th has and more. But don't bother with that one either because, by the time the 20th one happens, it'll be the same thing, but more and better.
And this is why I think for developers who release annual sequels or they're get on this development path of every year or two I'm going to release a new sequel to my game, you have to justify it. This is one of the issues I had with that Ceruleum series, that I was so excited to play Ceruleum Ultimate, but I'm still seeing the same issues that was in the last game. And I'm sure if he releases a Ceruleum Ultimate 2, those issues may still be in that one.
Yeah, we've already talked about the Final Fantasy series.
Mm-hmm.
The Final Fantasy series is it's pretty much not even a sequel.
Mm-hmm. It's more just a franchise with the same name.
Yeah, it's more of a series of games that have nothing to do with each other, but they all share similar theming and mood kind of thing, and and same thing goes with a lot of kind of RPGs like that.
Mm-hmm. And hey, Chris, thanks for putting us on the radio there.
Yeah.
Yep. And again, there are always going to be exceptions to these discussions. Again, the game industry is very weird when it comes to this. For everything that we talk about, I'm sure there's an exception that tries to prove the opposite. But
and they may succeed, because the thing about game development is nothing is absolute.
Mm-hmm. But
I started to quote the Assassin's Creed. That is absolute. I forget how the rest of that goes. But that is that's the motto in Assassin's Creed. Nothing is absolute. Everything is something, But they do all have a character named Sid. They all have similar things. They all have tropes that they've done through there. But they're not in the same world. They're not in the same universe. Although they kind of reneged on that when they came out with what was it? Final Fantasy Dissidia? I don't even know.
Dissidia? I don't know. Again, I'm not the guy for pronouncing names here.
But it's like DISSIA or something.
Yeah, the fighting game one.
Yeah, where all the where they pull characters out of all of the Final Fantasies. It's all the old ones.
Mm-hmm.
All the ones that actually mattered, in my opinion.
But I think let us wrap things up here. We still don't know what our topic will be for next week. So if you have any suggestions for that, be sure to leave in the comments down below. And of course, join our respective Discords.
Yeah, and make sure that you lick the smash button and smash the lick button. Mm-hmm. And join our Discord and Twitter and all that stuff. Links down in the description, and come back for more content on both of our channels. Make sure to follow both of our channels because we have different content on both channels.
Yep. And you'll find links to all of our contact information in our respective videos. Twitter, Discord, all that other great stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We need a snack button. That would be... Somebody invent that.
Would you lick the snack button, or would you smash the snack button?
Smash the snack button. It sounds like an advertisement for like a 90s extreme beverage or something.
But is it a Safeway extreme beverage?
Nah. Maybe. But that will do it for this week's show. Again, we record these shows live Sunday, starting around 4:30 ET. And if you would like to watch our Indie Store page review show, Indie Inquiries, those are taped starting around 3:30 ET on Thursdays.
Wait, we have tape?
Oh, virtual tape. Digital tape. There we go.
What about bubblegum tape?
But as always, come back for daily discussions on game design and extreme food motto pitches as well here and on game wisdom. So everyone have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.